Welcome to The Explainer. So, picture this. You've had one of those awful nights where you're just tossing and turning. You finally wake up after maybe a few restless hours, and you're already exhausted. But then, you notice something else. That ringing, buzzing, or hissing in your ears, it feels absolutely blaring. Like, it's literally impossible to ignore. It really feels like somebody sneaked in and turned the volume dial all the way up overnight. But is it just your imagination? Well, that brings us right to the central question of today's explainer. Can a lack of sleep actually trigger tinnitus? Honestly, this is one of the most common questions asked in audiology clinics around the world. Because, people feel it instinctively. They're dead tired, and the ringing is just louder. Okay, let's dive into this and see exactly what audiology and medical research have to say about the connection between sleep deprivation and that annoying ringing in your ears. Here's our quick roadmap for today. First, we'll look at what exactly tinnitus is. Then we'll talk about the amplification effect, explore the vicious cycle it creates, offer some much-needed reassurance, and finally, wrap up with some actionable strategies for better sleep.
All right, Section 1. What exactly is tinnitus?
To really understand why sleep affects this condition, we actually need to shift the blame a little bit. We all naturally assume it's entirely a problem with our ears, right? But science tells us we have to look much deeper. Tinnitus is the perception of sound, stuff like ringing, buzzing, hissing, roaring, or whistling, when there is absolutely no external source making that noise. And here is the key takeaway. It's a symptom, not a disease itself. It can pop up from a whole bunch of things, like hearing loss, noise exposure, natural aging, certain medications, or even specific ear disorders. To anchor this in the science, check out this quote from Katz's Handbook of Clinical Audiology. He points out that the brain, not just your ears, plays a massive role here. It's often related to actual changes within the auditory nervous system itself. So the crucial point is this. If we really want to understand tinnitus, we have to understand the brain. Basically, your brain is the master control center for how you perceive all these sounds. Moving on to Section 2, the amplification effect. Interestingly enough, research shows that a lack of sleep doesn't usually just magically create tinnitus out of thin air in healthy ears. Instead, what happens is that a tired brain amplifies the tinnitus you already have, making it seem way louder and way more bothersome. Think of it like this. A well-rested brain efficiently filters out unimportant sensory signals. It's kind of like a bouncer at a club, great at ignoring background noise. But a sleep-deprived brain? That filtering system becomes significantly less efficient, basically letting the tinnitus skip the line and demand way more of your active attention. And this brilliantly illustrates why the ringing feels incredibly loud when you're tired, even if the actual physical signal hasn't changed one bit. Your brain just lost its superpower to ignore it. The second huge factor here is increased stress hormones. When you don't sleep well, your body just dumps stress hormones into your system, particularly cortisol. This puts your entire body on high alert. And when you're stressed out like that, it specifically lights up the areas of your brain involved in emotion and attention. Your brain is basically being told, hey, there's a threat nearby, which makes it hyperfocus on any perceived abnormal signal, including, you guessed it, the ringing in your ears. Take a look at what James Snow Jr. says in his book, Tinnitus, Theory and Management. He writes, emotional centers, such as the limbic system, strongly influence how distressing tinnitus feels. Because a bad night of sleep spikes those stress hormones and fires up those emotional centers, it directly cranks up your anxiety. And that heightened anxiety literally dials up your perception of the tinnitus. It's wild, but the emotional distress you feel and the actual volume of the ringing you hear are deeply, deeply intertwined. Which leads us perfectly to Section 3, the vicious cycle. We've talked about brain alertness and stress hormones, but what about how we actually cope with it? Well, this is the frustrating loop so many people find themselves trapped in. Step 1, poor sleep makes your tinnitus worse, mostly because your concentration and emotional control are totally shot. Step 2, because the tinnitus feels so much louder, it causes intense emotional distress and anxiety. And Step 3, all that anxiety makes it incredibly hard to fall asleep the very next night. Sleep deprivation literally alters the brain networks that connect your auditory cortex with your emotional processing centers. And that is exactly why this cycle is so brutal to break, and why multiple nights of bad sleep just compound the whole problem. Now for Section 4, the reassurance. I know looking at that vicious cycle can feel super overwhelming, so let's just take a breath and clear up a major fear right here, right now. Current scientific evidence is crystal clear. 1 or 2 nights of poor sleep will absolutely not permanently damage your ears.
And it won't cause permanent tinnitus if you didn't already have an underlying issue. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the vital distinction between the cause of tinnitus and the amplification of it. Chronic sleep deprivation for sure worsens your symptoms because of all the fatigue and stress we just talked about. But a few bad nights, they are not the original root cause. Your ears are perfectly okay, your brain is just exhausted and hyper-aware right now.
Okay, let's wrap up with Section 5, Strategies for Better Sleep. So how do we take the control back from a totally exhausted brain? Well, if poor sleep amplifies the ringing, then improving your sleep hygiene is literally one of the most powerful tools you have for relief. Let's move to these evidence-based strategies and see how this builds a solid defense. First, try to maintain a regular sleep schedule. Yeah, even on the weekends. You'll also want to avoid caffeine and nicotine for several hours before bed, and try to cut out screen time for at least an hour before you go to sleep. Another great trick is to use gentle background sounds like white noise or rainfall to just give your auditory cortex something else to process instead of the ringing. Practice relaxation techniques like deep breathing or mindfulness to bring that cortisol down. And of course, if the tinnitus persists or comes with any pain, absolutely go consult an audiologist. Taking these steps builds a solid foundation of control over what you're hearing and feeling.
We've learned today that while a lack of sleep doesn't usually create tinnitus out of nowhere, it completely strips away your brain's ability to filter it out, making the sound louder and way more distressing. Improving your sleep might not eliminate the sound entirely, but it can massively reduce how much it dictates your life. So I want to leave you with this question to think about. If your brain controls how loud your tinnitus feels, how will you protect your sleep tonight? Thanks so much for exploring the science with me on The Explainer. Catch you next time.